The Duke's wineglass slipped when the new maid hummed the private melody he had written for his dead fiancée. The crystal struck the edge of the music room table, spilling a dark crescent of claret across an open score. Edward Rowan, 9th Duke of Ravenshaw, did not reach for the glass. Fire snapped behind the brass fender. Rain whispered against the tall windows, and the beeswax candles gave off a faint honeyed warmth that could not soften the cold running beneath his collar. The maid stood near the pianoforte with a dusting cloth in one hand and a bundle of fresh candles in the other. She wore a black wool gown, a white apron, and the narrow muslin cap required of the upper housemaids. Her face was thinner than the face he had carried through 5 years of sleep, but the left corner of her mouth still tilted before the right whenever she tried not to smile. She had been humming under her breath as she worked, 4 notes descending, 2 rising, then a pause exactly where Edward had once placed a wrong note simply to make Beatrice Langford glare at him. No one else had ever heard the unfinished melody. He had written it at 27 in the back parlor of her father's house, while she leaned over his shoulder and accused him of murdering harmony. The maid turned toward the spilled wine. "Your Grace, I beg your pardon." The sound of her voice stripped the room of 5 years. Edward's fingers closed around the edge of the table. "Sing the last line." The maid went still. A coal dropped inside the grate with a dry orange spark. "Your Grace, the melody. Finish it." Her eyes lowered to the ruined score. "I was not aware I had been singing. You were." He crossed the carpet. She took 1 step back, then stopped, the dusting cloth twisting once between her fingers. Candlelight caught a pale crescent beside her right thumb. A small scar from the day Beatrice had broken a cordial glass and insisted on sweeping the pieces herself. Edward had bandaged that thumb with a strip torn from his handkerchief while she laughed at his knot. His breath turned shallow. "What is your name?" "Bess Lane, Your Grace." "No." The word came too quickly. She flinched, not from its volume, but from its certainty. Edward slowed. "When I wrote that tune, what did you say about the 7th bar?" Her face emptied. "I do not know what you mean." "You said I had placed an E where any civilized man would put an F. Many composers make errors. I told you it was deliberate. That would have been vanity. You called it a crime." Her hand tightened around the candle bundle. He could see the pulse in her throat. "Look at me." She did, and the room became impossible. Hazel eyes, darker than he remembered. A small notch in the right brow where a childhood fall had left no scar on the skin but forever divided the hair. A faint freckle beneath the left eye. Time had changed her. Service had changed her. Nothing had changed the fact of her. Edward said the name he had not spoken aloud in years. Beatrice. The maid's lips parted. For 1 second she looked toward the door. Then she set the candles down with extraordinary care. "Do not call anyone." Edward glanced at the velvet bell rope beside fireplace, then back to her. "Why would I call anyone?" "Because your mother is in the house." The sentence struck differently from the recognition. "My mother." Beatrice looked toward the corridor as though the polished mahogany door were thin enough for footsteps to pass through it. "If the Dowager Duchess learns who I am before I know what you believed, I may lose the only chance I have to ask you the question that brought me here." Edward's hand dropped from the table. "You came here deliberately." "Yes, as a maid, yes, under another name." She glanced toward the service cloth in her hand. "That was the only name the registry would accept with my references. Beatrice Langford has references." "Beatrice Langford has been dead for 5 years." Edward felt the old sentence open inside him. He remembered Vienna in the autumn of 1814, a diplomatic dinner interrupted by a courier from England. He remembered the black-edged sheet in his mother's hand, carried inside a packet from Ravenshaw House. He remembered 6 lines stating that Beatrice had taken a fever while visiting cousins near Canterbury, worsened in 3 days, and been buried before Edward's letters could reach her. He had returned to England too late for anything but a stone in a churchyard and his mother's measured grief. They told me you died in Kent, he said. Beatrice's expression changed by a fraction. They told me you died in Vienna. Edward stared at her. Rain traced silver lines down the glass behind her. Who told you that? A woman wearing your mother's livery brought the letter. What letter? One bearing your family seal. It said you had taken a fever after the Congress opened. It said you died before you could return. I was never ill. I know. Her voice thinned on the last word, and she looked away. Edward moved toward the door, then stopped when she lifted one hand. Not yet. You think my mother did this. I think someone wanted each of us to mourn the other. And you waited 5 years to discover whether I was alive? Her eyes snapped back to his. I discovered it 11 days ago. The room fell silent except for rain and the soft hiss of claret soaking into paper. Beatrice drew a breath. My employer died in York last month. Her niece gave me 3 weeks' wages and a packet of newspapers for the journey south. Your portrait was in one of them beside a notice about the Ravenshaw Charitable Hospital. I had to read your name 4 times because the title had changed. Your father was alive when I knew you. You were Lord Edward Rowan. The paper called you the Duke of Ravenshaw. Edward's father had died 2 years after Beatrice's supposed funeral. Why did you not come to the front door? I did. Edward's chest tightened. When? 9 days ago. I stood across the square for nearly an hour. Then your mother's carriage stopped at the steps. Beatrice looked at the maid's cap in the mirror above the mantel, as if seeing a stranger framed in guilt. I had been told once that you were dead. I had no intention of announcing myself to the same household until I knew whether the lie belonged to you. Edward's jaw hardened. It did not. I needed to hear that from you. You could have written. A letter can be opened by anyone. He looked toward the door again. So you entered my house through the servants' registry, yesterday morning, and intended to reach me how? By being patient. A faint trace of the old dry humor touched her mouth. You made patience difficult by returning from White's before midnight. Edward nearly laughed, but the sound caught behind something sharper. Beatrice, I watched them lower a coffin with your name on it. Her face drained. There was a coffin, sealed. He heard himself say it and understood for the first time how useful a sealed coffin could be. Beatrice placed the dusting cloth on the pianoforte. Her fingers were steady now. Then we have more to learn than whether you believed me dead. Edward crossed to the music room door and turned the key. Not to keep her in, but to keep the corridor out. He left the key in the lock and stepped away from it. Tell me everything from the day the woman in my mother's livery brought you that letter. Beatrice remained beside the pianoforte for several breaths before moving toward the fire. The heat reached her first as a dry pressure against her cheek. The room smelled of damp wool from Edward's coat, singed wine on candlepaper, and the lemon oil used on the instrument. She did not sit until he drew a chair away from the hearth and asked, Would you rather stand? The question seemed to surprise her. No, I would rather sit. She lowered herself onto the chair, hands folded over the white apron, and Edward took the one opposite. September of 1814, she began. My father had been dead 8 months. I was living in his house in Bloomsbury while his affairs were settled. Your mother called twice that summer. She was never rude. That would have been easier. She asked whether I understood what marriage to you would require, whether I knew which forks to use at Carlton House, whether I could enter a room full of women who knew my grandfather had kept an apothecary's shop. Edward's mouth flattened. I knew she objected. I did not know she had approached you alone. You were in Vienna. Beatrice rubbed one thumb along the edge of her apron. On the 23rd of September, a woman came shortly after dusk. I remember the wet wheels outside, and the smell of horse sweat in the passage because Mrs. Woodley complained that the runner had marked her clean floor. The woman wore dark green with Ravenshaw braid at the cuff. She carried a folded paper and a small parcel. What parcel? Your signet ring. Edward looked at his right hand. The ring he wore now had belonged to his father. The one he had worn in 1814, a narrow gold seal engraved with a rook, had vanished during the journey from London to Vienna. He had blamed a careless valet. "I lost that ring on the road to Dover," he said. Beatrice gave a small, humorless nod. "The woman told me it had been removed from your hand." Edward's stomach tightened. "What did the paper say?" "That you had died of putrid fever in Vienna. That your body would be buried there because of the danger of transport. That your mother regretted I had received no final message." Firelight flashed against the brass fender. "Did you recognize the handwriting?" "No. It was a clerk's hand. The seal was yours." She looked at his fingers, and the ring made the lie feel solid. "What happened after?" 3 days later, Mrs. Woodley told me my father's creditors intended to sell the lease. I had known there were debts, but not how many. Your mother's secretary came with an offer. A widowed gentlewoman in North Yorkshire required a companion. The salary was small, but the post included lodging and respectable references. I had no near relations willing to take me, and every room in that house had become unbearable. Edward heard the restraint in the last sentence. "My mother arranged the position?" Her secretary said it came through a charitable connection. "Name, Mr. Pell." Edward knew the man. Pell had served the Dowager for more than 20 years and now kept a quiet office near Lincoln's Inn. "He still works for her." Beatrice's eyes lifted. "Then he may know more than we do. Where did you go?" "To Mrs. Rook, outside Ripon. I read to her, wrote her letters, kept her medicine chest, walked beside her bath chair when the lanes were dry, and learned that a woman can spend 40 minutes deciding whether a shawl is sufficiently mauve." The old Beatrice surfaced again for 1 instant. Edward let it pass without smiling. "You stayed 5 years, 4 years and 8 months. She was difficult, proud, and kinder than she intended anyone to notice. She also hated London. We did not travel south. Did you never see my name? Not the title I knew. After your father died, newspapers called you Ravenshaw. Before that, Mrs. Rook subscribed mostly to provincial papers and sermons. I stopped looking for reports of a dead man." She turned her face toward the fire. "I had no reason to search." Edward absorbed the accusation that was not directed at him, but still belonged in the room. "And after Mrs. Rook died, her niece arrived from Bath, thanked me, paid what was owed, and sorted the house with the speed of a military retreat. She gave me a bundle of old papers to wrap books. One sheet had your portrait." Beatrice's fingertips pressed into the apron. "You were standing beside a hospital foundation stone, alive enough to look annoyed by the artist. I was annoyed. I noticed. What did you do?" "I bought a seat on the mail coach the next morning." "Straight to London?" "With £12, 2 gowns, and Mrs. Rook's written reference." "Then you went to the servants' registry. After I saw your mother at the front door." She met his eyes. "I had spent years believing a message carried under your family arms. I needed a path into this house that did not depend on anyone deciding whether I deserved to reach you." Edward leaned forward. "And if I had known you were alive and chosen silence." Beatrice's jaw shifted. "Then I would have finished my week's wages, left by the same door I entered, and never allowed anyone named Rowan to decide anything for me again." The answer hurt, but its precision steadied him. "Fair. Is it?" "No, but it is fair." A floorboard sounded in the corridor. Both turned. A woman's measured voice passed outside, followed by the softer answer of a lady's maid. Edward recognized his mother. Beatrice's fingers went cold enough that she tucked them beneath the apron. "She must not see me yet." Edward rose. "You are under my roof. That did not protect me from a false funeral." He stopped. Beatrice reached into the pocket, hidden beneath her skirt, and drew out a small folded paper, creased until its edges had softened. "There is something I did not tell you." She held it by one corner. "Mrs. Rook's niece gave me this with my reference. She found it among old household correspondence. It is the letter that placed me with Mrs. Rook." Edward took it. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and age. The upper half contained a recommendation for Miss Bess Lane. described as a gentle woman reduced by misfortune, discreet, educated, and without troublesome family connections. At the bottom was a signature he knew before he reached it. Augusta Rowan. Edward read the date twice. 3rd of October, 1814. Beatrice nodded. How long after you were told I died? 10 days. Edward looked at her. She did not blink. He unfolded the black-edged notice his mother had sent him in Vienna from memory as clearly as if it lay in his hand. Beatrice Langford died September 26th. My mother told me you were dead, he said slowly, and 1 week later she arranged employment for you under another name. Beatrice's voice was nearly a whisper. That is why I became your maid instead of your caller. Another step sounded outside, closer this time. The latch moved once against the locked door. Edward? Augusta Rowan called from the corridor. Why is the music room locked? Edward glanced at Beatrice. She had already folded the incriminating letter and returned it to her pocket. The maid's cap sat white against her dark hair. The room's heat had brought color back to her cheeks, but her eyes were fixed on the door. Do you want her admitted? He asked. Beatrice stared at him. The question mattered. He saw that before she answered. No. Edward turned the key and opened the door only wide enough to stand in it. Augusta Rowan, Dowager Duchess of Ravenshaw, wore pearl-gray silk and an expression that had intimidated cabinet ministers, bishops, and 3 generations of tradesmen. The corridor lamps threw a clean gold line across the diamonds at her throat. Her perfume, orris and rosewater, drifted past Edward into the music room. You have locked yourself in with the wine, she observed. A dangerous precedent. I spilled the wine. More dangerous still. Her gaze moved toward the narrow opening behind him. I thought I heard a servant. You did. Then send her out. Lady Davenant has arrived, and the blue drawing room requires another lamp. Edward did not move. The servant is occupied. Augusta's brows lifted. With what? My business. For a moment only, the ticking bracket clock in the corridor disturbed the silence. Augusta's face did not change, but Edward knew the slight flattening around her mouth. You are 32 years old, she said. You need not manufacture smiths to avoid dinner guests. A fortunate reminder. He leaned closer. Did you know a woman named Bess Lane in 1814? The color at Augusta's temples altered so faintly another man might have missed it. No. Think carefully. I generally do. A companion placed with Mrs. Agnes Rook, near Ripon. His mother's gloved fingers closed around her fan. There were dozens of charitable placements after the war. Why are you asking? Edward held her gaze. I found an old recommendation. Augusta's eyes sharpened. In whose papers? He did not answer. The silence extended 1 second too long. Then Beatrice moved behind him. Not toward the door. Merely across the room to lift the stained music from the table. Paper whispered. Augusta's gaze snapped past Edward's shoulder. He widened his stance without thinking. His mother saw that too. Who is she? A housemaid. Name? Bess Lane. This time Augusta's fan stopped. Beatrice's hands remained on the score. Edward could hear rain striking the window, soft and continuous, and beneath it the faint clatter of dishes from the dining room 2 floors below. Augusta took 1 step forward. Let me see her. No. Beatrice spoke from behind him. It is all right, Edward turned. She stood beside the pianoforte, no longer pretending to dust. Her shoulders were straight. No, he said quietly. It is your decision. Beatrice's eyes met his. Then I decide she may look. Edward stepped aside. Augusta entered the room. The air seemed to sharpen with her. Beatrice faced her beneath the candlelight. For several heartbeats the older woman simply stared, her fan lowered. A muscle moved once beside her jaw. You, she said. Beatrice removed the muslin cap. She did it slowly, pulling the pins free and setting them on the pianoforte one by one. Her chestnut hair remained tightly braided at the back, flattened where the cap had rested. Good evening, Your Grace. Augusta's lips lost their color. What trick is this? A poor one, Beatrice said. It took 5 years. Edward closed the door. Mother, sit down. I will do nothing of the kind. Augusta's gaze flicked from Beatrice to him. Where did you find her? She found me. In that dress. Augusta's nostrils flared. You cannot possibly believe. I believe the woman who corrected the wrong note in a melody no one else knew. I believe the scar on her hand. I believe her account of my signet ring. I believe the letter you signed 10 days after telling me she was dead. Augusta's face became very still. Beatrice did not reach for the letter. She did not need to. Edward watched recognition settle into his mother's posture. Not guilt exactly, but calculation. You have no idea what you are inviting into this house, Augusta said. Beatrice's chin lifted. I entered through the servant's door yesterday. Whatever I invited came with me. This is not amusing. I have not found much of it amusing. Edward moved toward the fireplace. Did you tell Beatrice I died in Vienna? Augusta looked at him. There were circumstances you did not understand. That is not an answer. You were on the verge of attaching yourself permanently to a woman whose father had left debts, whose family possessed no standing, and whose presence would have made every political alliance more difficult. Edward's voice cooled. Still not an answer. Augusta opened her fan with a snap. The painted paper smelled faintly of sandalwood as it stirred the hot air. I prevented a mistake. Beatrice's hands stayed loose at her sides. By burying me, Augusta's eyes turned to her. No one buried you. Edward felt something inside him shift. I did. His mother looked away for the first time. A coffin was lowered in Kent, a memorial convenience. The phrase landed like a dropped stone. Beatrice's mouth opened, then closed. Edward took one step closer to his mother. What was in it? I do not know. Sand, perhaps. Stones. The arrangements were handled by Pell. You let me stand at a grave. You needed finality. You manufactured it. Augusta's voice sharpened. And you survived it. You inherited your title. You restored Ravenshaw's finances. You entered the Lords. And you did not ruin your future over an attachment formed when you were too young to distinguish devotion from defiance. Beatrice looked at Edward, not Augusta. He understood the question in that glance. Had he become the life his mother wanted? I never married, he said. Augusta's fan stopped again. Do not turn this into theater. You already provided the coffin. Beatrice inhaled, then spoke. Why send me to Mrs. Rook? Augusta's eyes narrowed. Because you had no income. My father left a small annuity, which his creditors contested. You could have told me Edward lived, and watched you pursue him across Europe. The dowager's tone held genuine disbelief. You were infatuated, penniless, and entirely unprepared for his position. Beatrice crossed to the table. The wood beneath her fingers was smooth and cool. So you gave me another name. I gave you employment. You told Mrs. Rook I had no family connections. At the time, that was the safest description. Safe for whom? Augusta's face hardened. For everyone. Edward said leave. His mother turned. Edward. Not the house. The room. Candle wax slid down one sconce in a slow white ridge. We are not finished. No, he said. We are barely started. But Beatrice has been in this house one day, and you have spent 5 years deciding what she should hear. You may wait outside one door. Augusta stared at him long enough for the fire to crack twice. Then she folded her fan, turned, and walked out. Her silk skirts whispered over the carpet. Edward closed the door but did not lock it. Beatrice remained by the table, staring at the place where his mother had stood. She admitted more than I expected. Not enough. Enough to know the lie was deliberate. Edward looked toward the servant cap lying on the pianoforte. You will not return to the maid's room tonight. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. That sounded dangerously like an order. He corrected himself at once. Where do you want to sleep? The tension at her mouth eased a fraction. Somewhere with a lock-eye control and no duchess on the other side. My sister's old sitting room has a bedchamber attached. The key stays inside. Then there. He nodded. And tomorrow? Beatrice reached into her pocket and took out the employment letter. Tomorrow I want to know who wrote my death, who hired the coffin, and how many people were paid to make 2 living people disappear from each other. Edward looked at Augusta's signature. Pell will have accounts. Will he show them to you? He will show them to the Duke of Ravenshaw. Beatrice's expression was dry. There are moments when rank is less objectionable than others. Edward almost smiled. Then she turned the paper over. On the blank reverse, in brown faded ink, someone had written a single line in a clerk's hand. Account charged to AR, private household, reference 1463. Beatrice tapped the number. What is that? Edward knew. A household disbursement reference. Where are the books? Ravenshaw House keeps 6 years of private accounts in the London strong room. Can your mother remove them? Not without the steward's key. Who has it? Edward looked toward the ceiling, where somewhere above them his mother occupied the grandest guest, suite in the house. Unfortunately, he said, the steward gave it to me last Michaelmas. Beatrice folded the paper. Then I suggest your grace learn to enjoy bookkeeping before breakfast. At 7 the next morning, Ravenshaw House had not yet become elegant. The corridors smelled of coal smoke, black lead, and bread warming near the kitchen range. Footmen crossed the lower hall in shirt-sleeves carrying scuttles. A housemaid knelt beside the stair rods with a brush, and somewhere behind the green baize door a cook struck a copper pan hard enough to make 3 voices answer at once. Beatrice came down the private staircase in a plain dark blue wool dress borrowed from Edward's unmarried aunt's traveling wardrobe. She had refused silk. She had also refused a maid. Her own hands had pinned her hair, not neatly enough to satisfy a duchess, and more than neatly enough to satisfy herself. Edward waited beside the library with 2 keys and a cup of coffee gone nearly cold. You look as though you slept, he said. I counted the quarter hours until 3 and then surrendered. The room, quiet. The lock, on my side. He nodded once. Beatrice looked at the coffee. You have not eaten. Neither have you. I had bread. That is not breakfast. That is precisely what bread has been attempting to become for centuries. The old rhythm between them appeared and vanished. Edward opened the library. Then a narrow paneled door hidden behind a screen. Stone steps descended into the service level. The air cooled immediately. It smelled of dust, iron, and damp mortar. At the bottom stood a room lined with shelves and deed boxes, its single window barred and high above the pavement. Edward unlocked the iron door. Private household accounts, he said. My mother kept separate books from my father because she considered his steward incapable of understanding ladies' expenses. Beatrice stepped inside. Was he? Entirely. Then her arrogance may be useful. They found 1814 in a calfskin ledger thick as a family Bible. The pages rasped beneath Beatrice's fingers. Edward set 2 lamps on the table, and the warm oil smell mingled with old leather. Columns of payments marched down the paper. Mantua makers, coach repairs, subscriptions, charitable gifts, wages, musicians, flowers. Beside many entries appeared a small reference number. Beatrice opened her employment letter and laid it flat. 1463. Edward turned pages until the September and October entries appeared. Here. The first item was ordinary enough. Payment to Pell for confidential correspondence. The second was not. Mr. J. Voss. Theatrical properties, Beatrice read. £8. Edward's gaze dropped to the note beneath it. Timber case, lining, church fee, transport to Kent. Her fingers stopped on the page. The seller seemed suddenly colder. A coffin, yes. The next line listed a payment to a sexton near Canterbury. Another to a printer for 6 morning notices. Another to a livery laundress. Then came the reference matching Beatrice's letter. £50 to the household of Mrs. Agnes Rook, described as an advance for the maintenance and placement of B.L. Beatrice stared at the initials. She paid Mrs. Rook, not your wages. It says placement consideration. Mrs. Rook never mentioned it. She may not have known why. Beatrice turned the page. There, 2 days later, appeared a payment to Mr. Pell for retrieval of correspondence from B.L. Premises. Edward's jaw tightened. Your letters. Or yours. Both. Beatrice looked around the strong room. Boxes rose from floor to ceiling. Where would retrieved letters go? If my mother intended to destroy them, nowhere. She kept the accounts. Because she never believed anyone entitled to question her. Edward's voice had gone flat. Pell may have kept the letters. Men who live by secrets often keep receipts. Beatrice touched the old initials again. Then we go to Pell, after breakfast. Edward, I can face conspiracy without eggs. I refuse to let you do it. She gave him a look that made him remember a summer afternoon when she had beaten him at chess in 11 moves. Very well. Eggs, then conspiracy. A knock sounded against the iron door. Edward turned. His steward, Mr. Keene, stood on the threshold with a leather-bound book tucked under his arm. Your Grace, forgive me. Mrs. Pritch. He saw Beatrice and stopped. Unlike Augusta, he did not stare at her face first. He looked at the dress, then at Edward, then at the open private ledger. Miss Lane, he said carefully, using the servant name. Beatrice straightened. Edward answered. Her name is Miss Beatrice Langford. Keene's brows rose, but years of service won over surprise. I see. He did not. No one could. He held out the book. The house steward's wage register requires a signature for yesterday's new servants. Mrs. Pritchard asked whether Miss Lane had completed hers. Beatrice looked at the book. The moment was almost absurd. She had entered the house under a dead woman's silence, and bureaucracy now wanted ink. May I? She asked. Keene placed the register on the table. The page showed names in neat columns. Wages, dates, duties. Near the bottom, Lane, Bess, upper housemaid, engaged 17 May 1819. The signature space remained blank. Beatrice picked up the quill. The nib scratched once against the paper, loud in the stone room. She wrote Bess Lane, then paused. A drop of ink gathered at the point. Edward watched her jaw tighten. No, she said. She drew one straight line through the false name. Beneath it she wrote Beatrice Langford in a hand that began small and ended firm. Keene's eyes moved from the name to her face. His expression changed. Miss Langford? Yes. My father served Lord Ravenshaw when you used to visit the estate. Did he? Keene swallowed. He said you once climbed the south wall because the conservatory door was locked. Beatrice looked at Edward. You told people that. It was an excellent story. I was trying to rescue a cat. The cat had no interest in rescue. Keene's face softened with bewildered recognition. Then it is truly you. Beatrice rested the quill across the inkwell. I am beginning to hope so. Edward closed the ledger. Mr. Keene, no one outside this room is to alter, remove, or destroy any account book from 1814 until I say otherwise. Yes, Your Grace. And if the Dowager asks, Keenes hesitated. I tell her Grace the order came from you. Exactly. Beatrice looked at the crossed-out servant name as Keene left. That will travel below stairs by luncheon. Do you want secrecy? Edward asked. I wanted one private answer from you. I have it. She closed the wage register herself. Now I want the truth faster than gossip. They breakfasted in the small morning room with no servants present. Coffee smelled dark and bitter. Toast cracked beneath the knife, and sunlight made the steam from the eggs briefly visible before it vanished. Beatrice ate with the concentration of someone who had learned not to assume a meal would remain uninterrupted. Edward noticed and said nothing. At 8:30, his carriage carried them toward Lincoln's Inn. The streets were slick from the night's rain. Hooves struck sparks from stone where the road had begun to dry, and open shop doors released smells of coffee, damp wool, tallow, and fresh sawdust into the morning. Mr. Pell's office occupied 2 rooms above a stationer's. He was not there. A clerk with red ink on his cuff bowed too many times and said Mr. Pell had been summoned unexpectedly to Ravenshaw House before 7. Edward's gaze sharpened. By whom? I could not say, Your Grace. Beatrice looked at the clerk's desk. When did the message arrive? Near 6. Whose hand? A lady's maid brought it. Edward and Beatrice spoke at the same time. My mother. The clerk blinked. Edward was already turning toward the stairs when Beatrice caught his sleeve. If she called Pell before dawn, she knows the strong room books can prove the payments. Keene will stop them. If they go through the strong room. Edward looked at her. Beatrice's face had gone still. Where else would Pell keep what he retrieved from my father's house? The clerk cleared his throat. Mr. Pell maintains a private tin dispatch box, miss. He never leaves it here overnight. Beatrice's fingers tightened on Edward's sleeve. Then your mother did not summon a man. She summoned the box. The carriage reached Ravenshaw House in less than 20 minutes because Edward twice ordered the coachman to take streets no Duchess would have considered respectable. When they entered, the hall smelled of wet leather and hot wax. A footman was carrying a tray toward the drawing room. He stopped at the sight of Beatrice without a cap, then nearly dropped the cups when Edward said, "Where is Mr. Pell?" "Blue drawing room, your grace." "With her grace." Edward started forward. Beatrice caught his wrist this time, not his sleeve. "Ask before you break the door." He looked down at her hand. "Do you want to come with me?" "Yes." "Do you want me to speak first?" "Only if I forget how." Together they crossed the hall. Voices came through the drawing-room door. Augusta's was low and clipped. Pell answered in a nervous murmur. Then metal scraped against metal. Edward opened the door without knocking. Augusta stood beside a writing table. Pell, narrow and gray-haired, had one hand on the lid of a green-painted tin dispatch box. The room smelled of strong tea, lavender polish, and the coal fire burning too hot for May. On the table lay a ring of keys. Augusta turned first. "I ask not to be interrupted." "You lost the privilege of arranging privacy for other people," Edward said. Pell went pale when Beatrice entered. He knew her at once. The key slipped from his fingers and struck the tabletop. Beatrice heard the small sound and watched his eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Pell." "Miss." He stopped. Augusta said, "Do not answer her." Beatrice almost smiled. "That is a familiar instruction." Edward closed the door. "Open the box." Pell looked at Augusta. "Your Grace, which one?" Edward asked. The clerk's face reddened. Augusta stepped between them. "The box contains my private correspondence." "Then we will discover whether my fiancée's death was private correspondence." Beatrice's eyes moved to him at the old word, but she said nothing. Augusta noticed. "She is not your fiancée. That is for Beatrice and me to decide, not you." The dowager lifted her chin. "You have no legal right to seize my papers," Beatrice said. "Then do not seize them. Ask Mr. Pell whether the box contains letters taken from my father's house." Pell stared at the carpet. "Mr. Pell?" Edward's voice was quiet. Sweat shone along the man's upper lip. "Some correspondence was removed for safekeeping after Dr. Langford's death." "By whose instruction?" "Her Grace's household." "Did you remove letters addressed to Miss Langford?" "I removed whatever I was told to remove." Augusta snapped. "Enough." Pell flinched. Beatrice looked at the tin box. "And my false death," he swallowed. "I did not write the notice." "Who did?" "A copying clerk." "At whose instruction?" His eyes went to Augusta before he could stop them. The silence answered first. Edward placed both hands on the back of a chair. "Open the box," Augusta said. "Pell, if you touch that lock, Mother." Edward's tone cut through hers. "You may dismiss him from your service afterward. You may complain to every relation we possess. But if you prevent him now, I will call my solicitor, my steward, and 2 witnesses from the hall, and we will make this louder." Augusta's face chilled. Pell inserted the key. The lid opened with a metallic groan. Inside were bundles tied with faded tape, household receipts, old seals, and a velvet pouch. Beatrice saw the pouch first. Her fingers went numb. Pell lifted it and placed it on the table. Edward opened the drawstring. A narrow gold signet ring fell into his palm, engraved with the rook he had used before inheriting the dukedom. "Mine," he said. Augusta looked toward the window. Beneath the pouch lay letters. Edward recognized his own hand on the top envelope. "Miss Beatrice Langford, Bedford Square." Unopened. Another beneath it. Then another, dated over 6 weeks in 1814. Beatrice touched one without lifting it. The paper felt dry and rough beneath her fingertip. "You never received these," Edward said. "No." Pell began to speak, but Augusta silenced him with a look. Beatrice untied a second bundle. These envelopes were addressed to Edward in Vienna. Her handwriting. Some had been opened. None had left London. "I wrote after the death notice," she whispered. Edward picked up the first. The seal had been broken and pressed closed again. "What did you say?" "I said I did not believe you were dead. I said your ring was not proof because you lost things whenever you traveled." Her mouth trembled once. "I begged you to answer in your own hand." Edward closed his fingers around the letter. Augusta's voice was hard. "You were grieving. I spared you the humiliation of silence." Beatrice turned. "You created the silence." Pell pulled a folded account from the bottom of the box. "Your Grace, there is something else." Augusta stepped toward him. Edward moved between them. Pell laid the paper down. It was an invoice from a printer near Fleet Street. 6 mourning notices concerning Miss Beatrice Langford, and 1 private death circular concerning Lord Edward, Rowan, all ordered under the same household account. Beatrice read the date. The same day. Pell's hands shook. Her Grace said the match would destroy his future. She said Miss Langford would recover if she believed the matter beyond remedy. Augusta's voice rose. "You were paid to obey, not to interpret." Pell's face tightened. "I was paid to write lies, Your Grace. I have interpreted them for 5 years." Edward looked at his mother. "Did Beatrice ever die in Kent?" Augusta did not answer. "Was there ever a fever?" Silence. "Did you send the ring?" Augusta's jaw set. "Yes." The word seemed smaller than the room. Beatrice did not move. "Did you tell him I was dead?" Augusta's eyes met hers. "Yes." "Did you tell me he was dead?" Another pause. "Yes." Beatrice's fingertips pressed against the table until the polished wood squeaked faintly under her nails. Edward watched her, waiting for tears, anger, anything he might be allowed to answer. Instead, she asked, "Why did you keep the letters?" Augusta's composure faltered for the first time. "Because burning them felt excessive." Beatrice gave a short breath that was almost a laugh and contained no amusement. "You buried me with more delicacy than you burned me." Augusta straightened. "I did what I believed necessary, for his title, for his life. His life was his." Beatrice pointed to the letters. "Mine was mine." The dowager's face hardened again. "You imagine choice is a private luxury. It is not. A duke marries a family, a fortune, a set of obligations. You had affection." "Affection passes," Edward said. 5 years failed to prove that. Augusta looked at him. "Then 5 more may." Beatrice gathered none of the letters. She left them where they were. "Perhaps. But if affection passes, it will pass because we lived long enough to choose differently, not because you wrote our deaths in ink." She turned to Pell. "Will you state what you have said here before Mr. Hargreaves?" Pell nodded. "If His Grace protects me from dismissal without wages," Edward answered, "I will pay every wage due whether my mother dismisses you or not." Augusta's eyes flashed. "You reward betrayal." "No, I am paying arrears on truth." Beatrice looked at Edward. "Call your solicitor." Then she looked down at the maid's apron she had not worn that morning, folded over the back of a nearby chair where a servant had left mending. "And after that, I want my wages for yesterday." Edward blinked. "Your wages?" "I worked from 6 until midnight." Pell stared. Beatrice's mouth finally curved. "If I am to return from the dead, I refuse to lose a day's pay doing it." Mr. Hargreaves arrived before noon with a leather case, 2 sharpened quills, and the expression of a man who considered scandal most useful when numbered. By 1 o'clock, the blue drawing-room had become an office. Sunlight warmed the carpet near the windows. Sealing wax smoked in a silver spoon. The scratch of pens replaced conversation. Pell made a written statement. Edward made another. Beatrice read both before signing anything herself. Augusta refused a statement at first, then dictated 3 paragraphs so carefully worded that Hargreaves removed his spectacles and said, "Your Grace, elegance will not alter chronology." She dismissed him from her attention and admitted the essential facts. She had caused false notices of death to be sent to Edward and Beatrice. She had intercepted their correspondence. She had arranged Beatrice's employment under an assumed name, and she had permitted Edward to believe a sham burial represented Beatrice's death. The admission did not require a magistrate to make Beatrice alive. She had never been legally dead. It required only witnesses to make the truth difficult to bury again. Hargreaves proposed notices to the families who had been informed of her death and a statement for the papers if Beatrice wanted one. "Do I have to explain the 5 years?" she asked. "No," he said. "You may state that a false report was deliberately circulated and that you have been living privately under another name." Privately. Beatrice glanced at the white apron on a chair, an ambitious word for polishing silver. Hargreaves's mouth twitched. "The newspapers need not know your occupation unless you choose to tell them." Edward said nothing. Beatrice looked at him. "You have an opinion." "I have several." "You asked the solicitor." She considered him, then turned back. "I will not lie about service to protect people who think service is shameful. But I will not feed 5 years of my life to strangers for breakfast either." Hargreaves nodded. "Then we say only what is necessary." By 3, the statements were sealed. Augusta left for her own house in Grosvenor Square without saying farewell. Her carriage wheels ground over the stones, then faded into traffic. Beatrice watched from the hall window. The glass felt cool beneath her fingertips. Edward stood 10 feet away. "Do you want me to ask what you feel?" he said. "No." "Excellent. I am improving." Slowly. She turned. "I want my trunk from the maid's room." "Of course. And my wages." "Keene has prepared them." "You warned him?" "I feared litigation." The joke brought a real smile this time. Keene met them downstairs with a small envelope and the household wage register. The servants' hall smelled of onion gravy, damp stone, and starch. Conversation stopped when Beatrice entered. She had spent one day among these people as Bess Lane, long enough to know which maid sang while folding linen and which footman stole sugared almonds from the dining room. Now they looked at her as though rank might suddenly grow from her sleeves. Beatrice disliked it immediately. "Please continue," she said. No one did. Keene cleared his throat and opened the register to her crossed-out name. "Miss Langford, your wages through today." She counted the coins, not from distrust but from habit, then signed the receipt in the proper column. Beatrice Langford. The nib made a faint rasp. Beside yesterday's false name, the real one looked neither grand nor fragile. It simply occupied its line. "Thank you, Mr. Keene." The younger housemaid who had shared a room with her blurted, "Were you truly dead, miss?" Beatrice looked at the girl's flour-dusted cuff. "Not particularly." A nervous laugh escaped someone near the pantry. The room breathed again. Beatrice carried her own trunk upstairs. Edward followed only as far as the landing. "Where will you go, Mrs.?" "Rookie's niece gave me the address of a respectable lodging house in Half Moon Street." "You may stay here as a guest." "I know. You may also leave." "I know. That too." She shifted the trunk handle in her palm. The leather was rough and warm from her grip. "That is why I am leaving." Edward's face did not change, though his hand closed once at his side. "Will I see you?" Beatrice looked down the staircase where the afternoon light lay pale across the black and white tiles. "Tomorrow at 4. If you ask." "Beatrice, may I call tomorrow at 4? "Yes." He took one step back, clearing the landing. She noticed. "Thank you." "For what?" "Not making departure another argument." Edward's voice was quiet. "I have had 5 years to learn what losing you feels like. I do not intend to practice it by holding a door shut." Beatrice lifted the trunk again. 4 o'clock. He watched her descend through the front hall, not the servants' passage. Keene opened the main door. Warm May air entered, carrying the smell of wet stone, lilac from the square, and horses. Beatrice stepped outside under her own name, with her own wages in her reticule, and no instruction in her pocket telling her where to go next. For the next 6 weeks, Edward called when invited and left when the clock required it. Beatrice's rooms in Half Moon Street were small enough that the tea table had to be moved whenever she opened the escritoire. They smelled of coal dust, fresh bread from the baker below, and the lavender soap her landlady placed in every drawer. Edward learned to knock and wait. Beatrice learned that sometimes the knock meant exactly what it claimed. A man at a door, not a decision already made for her. The newspapers printed a short correction concerning the false report of Miss Beatrice Langford's death. "I want the truth known," she told Edward. "Not my life turned into a public punishment." Pell's statement remained with Hargreaves. Augusta wrote twice. Beatrice answered once, with 3 sentences and no apology. June warmed into July. The city smelled of dust, horse chestnuts, and hot stone. One afternoon, Edward brought no flowers, no books, and no plan. He sat beside Beatrice's open window while a barrel organ played. "I have been invited to dine at Ravenshaw House on Thursday," Beatrice said. "By whom?" "Your steward." Edward looked offended. Keene has exceeded his authority. He said the household wished to see whether I could eat soup without disappearing. That sounds like the second footman. I intend to go. Edward turned the brim of his hat between his hands. "As my guest? As myself." That was the answer I hoped for. On Thursday, she arrived by hired carriage shortly before 8. Summer light still touched the upper windows. The front steps held the day's warmth beneath her slippers, and through the open door came the scents of beeswax, cut roses, and roast meat. Keene bowed. No one asked for Bess Lane. No one handed her an apron. The music-room doors stood open after dinner. Beatrice entered alone for a moment. The pianoforte had been polished. The score Edward had stained with wine was gone. On the side table lay the household wage register. She laughed softly when Edward appeared behind her. "Is this romance?" Keene left it for me to sign the quarterly accounts. A dangerous object. He came beside her. I thought so too. Beatrice opened to the page from May. Bess Lane remained crossed through. Beatrice Langford stood beneath it in brown ink. She touched the letters with one finger. That woman worked very hard for a day. She terrified a duke before supper. A useful skill. Edward's smile faded gently. "Do you regret coming here that way?" She considered it. Outside, carriage wheels rolled over the square. Inside, candle flames trembled in the warm draft from the open windows. "No, I regret that I believed I had to. But I chose the disguise. That matters," Edward nodded. He did not reach for her. "There is another choice I would like to ask about." Beatrice looked at him. "You are very solemn. I have been rehearsing and becoming worse." Then, "Stop rehearsing." He set his hat on the table. 5 years ago, I thought our promise was enough to carry us through whatever came. I was wrong. A promise can be intercepted. A letter can be hidden. A family can speak louder than 2 people who are far apart. Beatrice's hand rested on the open register. "That is an alarming beginning to a proposal. I told you I was becoming worse." Her mouth curved. Edward continued. "I do not ask you to become the woman I remember. I do not ask you to forgive my mother, live in her shadow, surrender your rooms, or pretend service did not belong to your life. I ask whether the woman standing here now wishes to build a life with the man standing here now." Beatrice studied his face. The candles showed new lines beside his eyes, the years she had not witnessed. She heard the faint rasp of leaves against the window and smelled the roses beginning to fade in their bowl. "Will I keep money in my own name?" "Yes." "Will I choose my own companion when we travel?" "Yes." "Will your mother select my gowns?" "I would sooner reopen hostilities with France." Beatrice laughed. Then she grew quiet. "And when I ask for a door left open, it stays open. When I ask for one closed, you hold the key." She breathed out slowly. "Then ask me plainly." Edward's voice lowered. "Beatrice Langford, will you marry me?" She looked down at the register. 5 years earlier, another woman had written her future in mourning ink. 6 weeks earlier, Beatrice had crossed out a borrowed name and restored her own. Now no clerk waited, no duchess instructed, no servant hovered with sealing wax. Edward stood still. Beatrice closed the register. Yes. The word was quiet, but it needed no witness. Edward lifted one hand and stopped before touching her cheek. Beatrice leaned forward, answering the unspoken question, and his palm warmed against her skin. When he kissed her, the open window carried in the ordinary sounds of London. Hoofbeats, distant laughter, a vendor calling strawberries before dark. Beatrice rested her hand against his coat, feeling the steady rise of his breath beneath the wool. Later, before they joined the others, she opened the register once more. In the empty margin beside her name, she wrote the date in a small, certain hand. Edward watched without asking what it meant. Beatrice sanded the ink, shook the grains away, and closed the book herself. 5 years had been taken from them by messages written in other hands. The years ahead would begin with a line she had written for herself.